All right, well, good afternoon and welcome to our second session of concurrent sessions. My name is Peter Ramuso. I'm an adjunct instructor here at Chestnut Hill College in the Political Science Department. And I'm very excited about the panels we have this afternoon. It's great for me to be able to moderate these. Probably were all the ones I would attend anyway, so we have a great lineup. So first this afternoon we have Dorothea Keiter, who will be talking about magical properties in the wizarding world. And Dorothea is from Germany, where she teaches and does research. But most importantly, she currently lectures at my alma mater, the Hogwarts of American Law School's Harvard Law School. So please, Dorothea Keiter, come on up.
Thanks, Peter. Just a little disclaimer, I don't lecture at Harvard, I'm just a visiting researcher. It's still Harvard Law School, yes. Thanks first to all the organizers for making this amazing magical conference happen. I'm so delighted to be here and to be able to speak to you today about magical property. So let's jump right in with two quotes. Professor McGonagall raised her wand again and pointed it at Snape's desk. A large plate of sandwiches, 2 silver goblets, and a jug of iced pumpkin juice appeared with a pop. When they had eaten as many sandwiches as they could, the plate kept refilling itself. They rose and left the office, treading the familiar path to Gryffindor Tower. Second quote. One casual wave of his wand, and the long tables flew to the edges of the hall and stood themselves against the walls. Another wave, and the floor was covered with hundreds of squashy purple sleeping bags. Yeah, those two quotes from Harry Potter may seem to be chosen a little bit randomly, but they aren't. I chose them for a common purpose, and that's, of course, property. Those quotes show us a picture of a magical world full of abundance, where plates of food magically refill themselves, and where sleeping bags can be conjured out of thin air. Thus, one might conclude that property in the wizarding world follows completely different rules than in our Muggle world, and that it is not as important. But surprisingly, this is not true. Why? And what concept of property is underlying the Harry Potter series? These are the questions that I'm going to tackle in my talk here. I will approach them in 3 steps. You can see them on my slides. First, I'm going to lead you through a text analysis. Second, I'm going to explain John Locke's property theory, which I propose to be a theoretical framework here. And finally, as a third step, I will apply Locke's theory to the Harry Potter books. Okay, but first, let's have some common ground what we are talking about. What is property? In legal thought, and I'm tempted to say, as always, among lawyers, there are different answers. For today, for my talk, I'm going to focus on the most common sense and most classical approach, which defines property as thing ownership. To own a thing means that I can use it as I wish without anyone interfering. In Anglo-American legal thought, this approach is mostly linked to the name of William Blackstone, the eminent English property theorist of the 18th century. He puts it a lot more sophisticated than I do and defines property as the, quote, sovereign despotic dominion which one man claims and exercises over the external things of the world and total exclusion of the right of any other individual. The important part of Blackstone's definition for me today is that owning a thing draws boundaries. It's mine, not yours, or yours. And by excluding others, I can make sure that it is only I who makes use of my belongings' economic value. But again, coming back to the question, what is the economic value of property in the wizarding world? In order to answer that question, let's now take the first of my steps. So, the text analysis. I looked for mentions of property and ownership in all the 7 Harry Potter books. But before I go into detail about the different categories of magical property that I found, let me point out one common feature they all share. Each of them is tied to specific magical qualities, and it's these characteristics that make them qualify as magical property. Now, let's dive into the details. First, the Harry Potter books mention property quite often in the context of things that have been created or enchanted by wizards, who give these objects unique magical abilities. Examples include wizard-made inventions like Dumbledore's Deluminator, Quidditch racing brooms, the Marauder's map, Sleek Easy's hair potion, and Fred and George Weasley's joke products. The magical qualities of these objects seem to be a sort of protection against duplicating, so copying spells. And this is why I assume Fred and George can build a business around creating joke shops, developing, selling them, because they have a kind of copy protection that sets them apart from ordinary non-magical objects like the sleeping bags I mentioned in the second quote of my opening quotes. The second and perhaps most obvious category involves objects with magical properties that go beyond the skills of wizards. Often, these are very powerful items. To start, anything made by goblins falls into this category, such as Gryffindor's sword or Auntie Muriel's tiara. Although wizards can make copies of these objects, think about the Sword of Gryffindor in Deathly Hallows, goblins can always tell the difference, no matter how skillfully the copy was made. Goblin-made objects have special magical properties that surpass wizarding abilities. In particular, they have the power to absorb only substances that make them stronger, while they repel all other outside influences. Next, they are magical substances from nature, whose powers cannot be created or replicated by wizards. This mostly applies to rare potion ingredients, take boomslang skin, for example, or other magical substances like gillyweed, and to one-core materials such as unicorn hair or dragon heartstrings. Ones actually overlap with my first category of magical property because their power comes not only from their core, but also from the expertise of a skilled wand maker who has to select the right wood to pair with the core. And last here, let's talk about wizarding money. Wizarding coins are made by goblins, and they carry a serial number to identify the goblin who has cast them. This prevents money from being magically created out of thin air, as we see with the leprechaun's fake galleons or the Weasleys' financial struggles. My next category involves objects that don't have obvious magical powers but have a special background. Their physical form can be copied, but their true magic comes, for example, from their history. We see this in the case of Hepzibah Smith's interest and fascination with Helga Hufflepuff's cup and Slytherin's locket. The last category of property I'll cover today is, broadly speaking, living creatures with also special abilities. So let's talk about owls first. Though owls aren't explicitly considered to be magical creatures, they possess remarkable abilities adjacent to magic. For instance, they can understand their owner's instructions, and they deliver mail accurately, even when pseudonyms are used by the sender. Quite remarkable, right? So, and as for real magical creatures, Hogwarts appears to have its own herd of thestrals. Lastly, the books frequently mention the ownership of house elves. House elves have their own unique magical powers. Some of them even surpass those of wizards. Think about operating within Hogwarts and want less magic. It's worth noting that in this context, the books often use master as a synonym for owner. And this shift in language highlights a simple truth: property is power. Okay, now let's for a moment leave the world of Harry Potter and enter 17th century Muggle England to explore John Locke's property theory. John Locke is one of the most influential philosophers of the Enlightenment, particularly known for his ideas on natural law and social contract. You are a mostly US-American audience, so you will all know that his work has had a significant impact on the American Declaration of Independence, and in legal thought, his property theory remains very influential until today. Locke's property theory is closely linked to his broader political philosophy. which aims to develop a theory of a legitimate government based on individual consent rather than on God-given rule or tradition. Locke has outlined his property theory in the second of his 2 treatises of government. His starting point is the state of nature. Here, Locke's Christian faith is key to understanding his ideas. He views humans in the state of nature as God's property. God, through his workmanship, that's a quote, created humans, giving them both the right and the duty to preserve themselves. From this, Locke concludes that humans are entitled to the means that are necessary for their survival, and that they have natural rights, especially to life, health, liberty, and property. So for Locke, property provides the material foundation for liberty. However, initially, in the state of nature, there was no private property. The earth and its resources belong to everyone in common. So how does private property come into being now from here? And that's what Locke's famous labor theory of property is about. Locke argues that everyone has a natural right to their own body. He also believes that God gave the earth to humanity for the purpose of improving it through labor. And since labor comes from a person's body, Locke reasons that individuals have a right to the fruits of their own labor, since both are inseparable. Like, quite logical, right? Therefore, when someone takes a piece of land from the commons and improves it through their work for the sake of the whole community, that land becomes their private property. Finally, let me mention that Locke's concept of property isn't just about owning things. He closely linked property to liberty, as I already mentioned, and for him, property is a fundamental right to express and develop one's personality based on individual character and abilities. In this way, already Locke connected the idea of property to unique properties, in the plural, as I have done in the title of my talk here. So this is the first link between his property theory and Harry Potter. Okay, next step. Let's apply Locke's theory to Harry Potter. First, let's look at Locke's theory to better understand the different concepts of ownership between wizards and goblins. I will read a passage from Deathly Hallows to you. It is also on my slide. It's, of course, you will all recognize it, Bill Weasley speaking to Harry. If you have struck any kind of bargain with Griphook, you must be exceptionally careful. Goblin notions of ownership, payment, and repayment are not the same as human ones. To a goblin, the rightful and true master of any object is the maker, not the purchaser. All goblin-made objects are, in goblin eyes, rightfully theirs. But if it was bought, Harry interjects, Bill again, then they would consider it rented by the one who had paid the money. They have, however, great difficulty with the idea of goblin-made objects passing from wizard to wizard. You saw Griphook's face when the tiara passed right under his eyes. He disapproves. I believe he thinks, as do the fiercest of his kind, that it ought to have been returned to the goblins once the original purchaser died. They consider our habit of keeping goblin-made objects, passing them from wizard to wizard, without further payment, little more than theft. I find this passage very illuminating. It seems to me that the goblins, at least the fiercest among them, as Bill says, embody Locke's labor theory in a very extreme form. For products of their own craftsmanship, they recognize only the maker as legitimate owner in the long run, not the purchaser. Wizards lack the skills to create such an object, like goblins have. So a wizard could only pay a certain amount of money for a goblin-made object, but then he would only be entitled to hold it for a limited time. Admittedly, this rental period can be quite long, potentially as long as the entire lifespan of the wizard who bought it. That's what Bill hints at. However, after this original purchaser dies, the goblins would insist that the object be returned. Looking through the lens of Locke's theory, one could argue that the goblins represent a highly meritocratic as well as group-based view on property. They accept money in exchange for their skillfully crafted objects, but only for the benefit of the one wizard who made the payment, and thus who has earned the right to possess the item. And ideally, this wizard has earned his money that he paid the goblin through his own labor before. The goblins also appear to reject human inheritance law. In their view, wizards cannot pass on goblin-made objects to their heirs. In a certain way, this also aligns with Locke's theory, since one could argue that the heirs have not invested their own labor or money or merits to earn the possession of the object, right? However, wizards and most legal systems in the Muggle world today believe that ownership includes the right to pass down an object through inheritance. As I have already mentioned, the goblin's view seems quite extreme at first, and also impractical from an economic perspective, since goblin-made objects would need to be returned to their makers every time a wizard purchaser dies. A lawyer would say now, this would seriously complicate the transferability and marketability of such items. However, upon further reflection, the goblin's perspective aligns well with contemporary debates about the legitimacy of inheritance law, which is, after all, not based on the heir's performance, merits, or labor, but just on family. And indeed, in his second treatise of government, Locke is less than enthusiastic about the idea of children automatically inheriting their parents' fortune, regardless of their own merits. While it might be a stretch to interpret this passage as a hidden critique of inheritance law from a left-wing perspective, the clash between these different concepts of property between wizards and goblins brings us back to the roots of Locke's property theory. It is labor and the improvement of objects in the interest of the community that are fundamental to private property, according to Locke. The freedom to transfer, sell, and trade is a subsequent effect of the right to property, not its core essence. And going up to another level, it seems to me that the goblins believe that they hold a kind of a group-based intellectual property over their object that they have crafted. Bill suggests this when he speaks not of any individual goblin maker of an item, but of goblins in the plural several times here in the quote. So to my view, this implies that the goblins see these items as a part of their collective cultural heritage, something they claim ownership of as a group based on their craftsman skills. Okay, let's zoom out here and use Locke's theory as a tool to explore the broader underlying meritocratic view of property in Harry Potter. Locke's labor theory specifically focuses on the active and industrious individuals among humans and highlights the importance of labor. Let's look for a few more examples to support this idea. First, Fred and George Weasley end up being quite rich and successful with their joke business. Although Molly initially opposes their plans to start a joke shop, the books seem to support the idea and support the twins by telling us, the readers, about their business success in the end. And while the twins didn't follow the traditional meritocratic path, starting with excellent academic achievements at Hogwarts, they invested a lot of work, creativity, and talent in their business. And this is precisely the kind of labor that Locke's theory highly values. Second, another fascinating example is wand ownership. There are two ways to achieve ownership of a wand. To begin with, it can be purchased at Ollivander's, or, of course, any other wand maker's shop. However, to truly own it, the wand must choose the wizard, not the other way around. This means that genuine wand ownership is tied to specific magical qualities of the wizard. Again, he has to demonstrate that he is worthy and a good match for the wand. And moreover, a wand can change allegiance, which means it can be conquered. The transfer of ownership happens without the original owner's consent and is typically the result of the superior skills of the wizard who vanquishes the previous owner. Finally, it's worth noting here that the language used by the books is similar to the language used on House of Ownership, Again, the books use master interchangeably with own, which is quite interesting. And speaking of, let's get to my last example, house elf ownership. House elves are my final and most complex example. While Hermione's efforts for house elf liberation eventually are unsuccessful, the language used in the books makes it clear that house elf servitude is not presented as an acceptable form of property. At this point, let me just briefly say that I cannot go into bigger questions of slavery, social justice, etc. here, but I have to limit myself to questions of property theory. So how does this portrayal of house elf ownership fit in with Locke's property concept? Does it, or yeah, if so, how? My answer is both yes and no. House elf ownership does not meet the meritocratic ideal that property should be earned through labor and industry. On the contrary, house elf ownership is passed down in dynasties, tied to breeding and old wizarding family lines. This represents exactly what Locke was arguing against in his two treatises in 1689. The idea of legitimizing property, wealth, and power through traditions and bloodlines, as seen in monarchist and authoritarian systems. To take it a step further, the series shows house elves mainly serving the indulgent and consumption-driven habits of their masters. They don't contribute to any productive or socially beneficial work. They are associated more with luxury than with industry. Of course, this is mostly because we never see families like the Malfoys, the Blacks, or Hepzibah Smith engaging in productive labor. They're wealthy enough not to need it. So house elf ownership fails Locke's labor criterion in two ways. First, by acquiring house elves without labor and merits, and second, by not using their labor for productive purposes. The Hogwarts house elves seem to be the only exception to this claim. They aren't, at least not obviously, abused or exploited, and they contribute to a well-respected goal, supporting the education of the young wizarding and witches generation. Okay, to sum up briefly. I have argued in my talk today that John Locke's property theory is a key framework for understanding the many facets of ownership in the wizarding world. And by explaining that magical property is rooted in certain magical properties and legitimized through labor and industry, I've shown that Harry Potter aligns in many ways with widely accepted meritocratic ideas in our Muggle world and legal thinking, while also revealing that there's critical potential in Locke's theory as well. Whether I have succeeded with the bold aspiration I made in my title, like making sense of property in the wizarding world, I leave that for you to decide and to discuss with me. So I'm happy to take your questions and comments. Thank you so much.
Nice.